I believe in the Church of Baseball. I've tried all the major religions and most of the minor ones. I've worshipped Buddha, Allah, Brahma, Vishnu, Siva, trees, mushrooms, and Isadora Duncan. I know things. For instance, there are 108 beads in a Catholic rosary, and there are 108 stitches in a baseball. When I learned that, I gave Jesus a chance. But it just didn't work out between us. The Lord laid too much guilt on me. I prefer metaphysics to theology. You see, there's no guilt in baseball, and it's never boring, which makes it like sex.
I hate to interrupt. I wish we could watch the rest of Bull Durham together, or Field of Dreams, or The Natural, or A League of Their Own, or all the other baseball movies which I have at home in our collection. But I'm here to talk about turning points and moments of grace, and a huge turning point for me occurred in the early 70s when I read a baseball book called Ball 4 by Jim Bouton. Before I can talk about Ball 4, though, I have to set the stage. You see, in 1962, at about the age of 4, I moved to the town of Berger, Missouri, with my mom, my new stepfather, and my 2 older brothers, Carl and John. Berger, population 206, is on the Missouri River, about 90 miles west of St. Louis. How I got there is a long story, which I will spare you, but once I got there, I rarely left. And the influence a game of baseball had on me is in large part due to the isolation of growing up in Berger. Of course, growing up in the 60s, we also had the St. Louis Cardinals. They were quite successful in that period, winning the National League pennant 3 times and the World Series twice, once against the hated Yankees and the other against the even more hated Red Sox. We rarely traveled farther than attending a St. Louis Cardinals baseball game at Busch Stadium, and at most that was once or twice a year. So we played baseball, collected soda bottles for the 5-cent deposit to buy packs of baseball cards, and listened to games on the radio. I have empathy for people who think baseball is boring and takes too long and nothing ever happens. But if you ever had a chance to listen to Jack Buck and Harry Carey broadcast a game in 1967, when Bob Gibson was throwing BBs and Lou Brock was stealing bases left and right, you might think otherwise. I learned to keep score listening to those games on the living room floor with my brother, and I believe keeping score at a baseball game is a chance to capture a moment of grace. Billy Crystal made a documentary called 61 about Roger Maris breaking Babe Ruth's single-season home run record in 1961. In it, he describes a scene in City Slickers when his character Mitch recounts going to a Yankees game as a kid and learning to keep score, and how in real life he got Mickey Mantle to sign that same scorecard years later. Which brings me back to the book Ball 4. Remember that, my turning point? Reading books was an escape for my brothers and me. We read and reread just about anything we could get our hands on. The problem is, we could not get our hands on much. There was no library. So in summer, every few weeks, the bookmobile came to town, a library on wheels. But that is not where I found Ball 4. What I found instead were glorified accounts of baseball greats, Mickey Mantle, Ted Williams, Dizzy Dean, Babe Ruth, the Gas House Gang, Pee Wee Reese, and on and on and on. And they perpetuated the myth of the baseball hero and the idolatry that we, as kids, directed their way. Now in 1967, Roger Maris was traded by the Yankees to the Cardinals, where he played 2 seasons. For me, getting to see Maris in the flesh playing right field at Busch Stadium was akin to dying and going to heaven. I mean, this was the guy who broke Babe Ruth's record. Our seats were never close. We were always up in the rafters, so he was just a speck way below us. But just being in the same stadium with him and Gibson and Brock and Flood and the rest of the ball players was a thrill. Apollo 11 landed on the moon on Sunday, July 20th, 1969. Of course, I had a baseball game that day down at the park, and I remember racing home to watch Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin step out of the lunar module and walk on the moon. I remember thinking how groovy it was. That's how we talked back then. How groovy it was to be alive to witness a moment of such historic significance. I thought the same thing on the night of April 4th, 1974. That was when Hammerin' Hank Aaron of the Atlanta Braves broke Babe Ruth's record for career home runs when he hit number 715 off of Al Downing. In 1969, a former fastball pitcher for the Yankees and teammate of Roger Maris named Jim Bouton took notes during the season. He was a knuckleball pitcher by then, barely hanging on to a spot on the roster of a short-lived expansion team, the Seattle Pilots. He recorded minute and intimate details about the daily grind of being a player, about his teammates, and the goings-on in and outside of the clubhouse. In doing so, he violated many unwritten rules. The book that came out of his experiences was Ball 4, and he became instantly notorious and ostracized by the baseball community. Samantha presented me with an autographed copy of Ball 4 a few years ago, and Jim Bouton's baseball card was one of two I retained from the 5,000 or so that my brothers and I collected over the years. Ball 4 is not great literature, but reading the book 3 or 4 times in the early 70s changed my life. You see, Mickey Mantle was no longer a mythical player who I had read glorified accounts of in books from the bookmobile. Instead, he and most of the other players became a bunch of young knuckleheads with all the warts and faults and vices that we all share. Bouton revealed a great deal about the game of baseball, that it is a great game, but in the end, just a game played by a select group of talented people who, generally speaking, were more prone to reading comic books than novels, and whose juvenile humor involved shaving cream pies in the face, nailing someone's shoes to the floor, and putting Bengay ointment in somebody's jockstrap. So Ball 4 revealed all the dirty underbelly of baseball, and taught me a few new swear words to boot. On the other hand, my turning point also involves a few players that demonstrated moments of grace. Now, we already talked about Roger Maris and how he suffered through many tough times in 1961. Many thought it was Mantle's destiny to be the one to break Ruth's record of 60 home runs in a season, and Maris paid the price for it. Years later, when Mark McGwire broke his record in 1998 as a St. Louis Cardinal, although he had passed away years earlier, Roger Maris got the recognition he long deserved. I wear number 21 on my umpire uniform. I almost chose number 20 because that was Lou Brock's number and he was one of my favorite players. But I chose number 21 for a couple of reasons. In October of 1969, Curt Flood was an all-star center fielder for the St. Louis Cardinals, and he refused to be traded to the Philadelphia Phillies, challenging the reserve clause that at the time was in all standard player contracts. The reserve clause said that although the contract had expired, the rights to the player were to be retained by the team to which he had been signed. Practically, this meant that although the player's obligation to play for the team, as well as the team's obligation to pay the player, were terminated, the player was not free to enter into another contract with another team. The player was bound to either A, negotiate a new contract to play another year for the same team, or B, ask to be released or traded. In 1970, Curt Flood refused to do both and sat out the entire season. In his book, The Way It Is, he says, "I lost money, coaching jobs, a shot at the Hall of Fame. But when you weigh that against all the things that are really and truly important, things that are deep inside you, then I think I've succeeded." Regardless of the politics, baseball helped get us through post 9/11. In the HBO documentary 9 Innings from Ground Zero, former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani said, "The only two things that got my mind off it at any period of time in the fall of 2001 were baseball and my son's football games."
vote for him, but at that point, my personal feelings about him as a politician was gone. I watched him, and he was my representative, and I had never felt that way before. Very nice show, Mr. President.
But in any case, if you remember that time period and those games when the Yankees were playing the Diamondbacks, it seemed inevitable that the Yankees were destined to win the World Series. But they did not, and that to me is a moment of grace. Not because I don't like the Yankees, which I don't, but because it shows that nothing is preordained, and in the games that we choose to play and watch and umpire, you can only anticipate what might happen, and then be amazed and surprised when it doesn't. So let me end with a continuation of the clip from Bull Durham, as Annie Savoy is walking to the park on opening day. And as she enters the stadium and walks through the breezeway and the expanse of the field is revealed to us all, I would suggest we attempt to be aware of moments of grace and turning points in our lives, regardless of where they come from, but in this case, provided by the Church of Baseball. And I suggest we stop for a beer and a dog.
It's a long season and you gotta trust it. I've tried them all, I really have. And the only church that truly feeds the soul day in, day out is the Church of Baseball.